Miss Marple's Missing Shoe. A Trail That Led to a Shallow Grave. Chapter 1. The Vanishing Clue. The morning sun cast a soft golden glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's modest cottage. The village was stirring gently, as it always did, with the faint clatter of milk bottles and the distant bark of a dog. Miss Marple, ever an early riser, sat at her small oak table, a cup of tea steaming beside her knitting. Her fingers moved with the practised ease of years, but her sharp eyes were fixed on something outside her window, a peculiar sight that disrupted the morning's tranquillity. There, on the cobblestone path leading to her garden gate, lay a single shoe. It was a woman's shoe, elegant and out of place, its black leather polished to a gleam and its delicate heel unscuffed. Miss Marple tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. A single shoe, abandoned without its mate, was not merely an oddity, it was a question begging to be answered. She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her cardigan before stepping outside. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew and roses. The shoe lay precisely where the path curved towards the gate, as if placed with care rather than dropped in haste. Miss Marple crouched, mindful of her knees, and examined it closely. The leather was supple, the stitching meticulous. A shoe of quality, not the sort one would carelessly lose. There were no signs of wear, no mud or scuffs, and yet it bore a faint, almost imperceptible trace of lavender, a scent that lingered like a whisper. She glanced up and down the path. The cobblestones were undisturbed, with no footprints or drag marks to suggest a struggle. The surrounding grass, still damp with dew, showed no signs of trampling. It was as if the shoe had simply materialized, a solitary clue in a village that thrived on routine. Miss Marple straightened, her mind already turning over possibilities. A lost shoe might belong to a distracted villager, perhaps one hurrying home after an evening at the Blue Boar, but the shoe's pristine condition and its placement suggested something more deliberate. She thought of her nephew Raymond's detective novels, with their dramatic clues and sinister motives. Fiction, she murmured to herself, but not entirely without merit. She returned to her cottage, fetching a clean handkerchief to carefully lift the shoe. She placed it on her kitchen table, studying it as one might a rare artifact. The size was small, perhaps a 5, and the style was modern yet timeless, suitable for a young woman of means or one with a taste for elegance. The lavender scent intrigued her most. It was not the artificial perfume of a shop-bought spray, but the true earthy fragrance of the plant itself, as if the shoe had brushed against a blooming garden. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting to the village. St. Mary Mead was small, its residents known to her as intimately as the stitches in her knitting. A stranger would stand out, and an item as personal as a shoe would surely be missed. She considered the possibility of a prank. Young Tommy Pierce was fond of mischief, but dismissed it. The shoe was too fine, too purposeful. Her gaze fell on the garden beyond her window, where the path led to the lane and eventually to the heart of the village. Someone had passed this way, she reasoned, and left the shoe as a marker, a message, or perhaps a mistake. The question was who and why. Miss Marple resolved to begin her inquiries after breakfast. She would visit Mrs. Bantry, whose knack for gossip rivaled her own, and perhaps stop by the post office, where Miss Weatherby was sure to have overheard something. The shoe, she decided, was not merely lost. It was a thread in a tapestry yet to be woven, and she would follow it wherever it led. As she cleared her teacup, a breeze stirred the curtains, carrying the faint scent of lavender once more. Miss Marple paused, her lips curving into a faint smile. "A clue," she said softly, "is only the beginning." Chapter 2. Whispers in the village. The high street of St. Mary Mead hummed with its usual morning rhythm. A gentle cadence of bicycles chatter, and the occasional clop of a horse-drawn cart. Miss Marple, her straw hat firmly in place, and the mysterious shoe tucked carefully in a cloth bag, made her way towards the village centre. Her steps were measured, her expression serene, but her eyes missed nothing. The flutter of a curtain, the glance of a passer-by, the subtle pause in a conversation as she approached. Her first stop was the post office, a cramped space where Miss Weatherby presided over stamps and secrets with equal authority. The bell above the door jingled as Miss Marple entered, prompting a sharp glance from the postmistress. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Miss Weatherby said, her tone laced with curiosity. "Not often we see you so early." "Good morning, Edith," Miss Marple replied, her smile disarming. "I thought I'd post a letter to my nephew, and perhaps catch up on the village news." She placed a penny on the counter, her fingers lingering as she added, "There's a curious air about St. Mary Mead today, don't you think?" Miss Weatherby's eyes gleamed. "Curious indeed. You've heard, then, about the stranger seen near the churchyard last night?" She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Mrs. Price's boy, young Billy, swears he saw a man skulking by the yew trees just after dusk. Tall, he said, with a hat pulled low. Not one of ours, that's certain." Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her face remained placid. "A stranger, you say? How intriguing. Did Billy notice anything else?" Miss Weatherby shook her head. "Too dark," he said, "and he wasn't keen to linger. But Mrs. Price reckons it's no good. Strangers lurking about. She's convinced he's up to mischief. Poaching, perhaps, or worse." She paused, eyeing the cloth bag. "What's that you've got there, if I may ask?" "Oh, just a little something I found," Miss Marple said lightly, patting the bag. "Nothing to trouble you with." She steered the conversation back. "This stranger, has anyone else mentioned him?" Miss Weatherby needed little prompting. Mrs. Bantry's maid, Elsie, said she saw a figure crossing the lane near the vicarage around the same time. Didn't get a good look, mind you, but she said he moved quick, like he didn't want to be seen. And then there's old Mr. Giles, who claims he heard footsteps on the gravel path past his cottage, though he couldn't swear to it. Miss Marple nodded, filing each detail away. A stranger near the churchyard, seen by multiple witnesses, yet elusive enough to avoid clear identification. The timing aligned with the appearance of the shoe, and the churchyard was not far from her own cottage. Coincidence, perhaps, but Miss Marple distrusted coincidences. Thanking Miss Weatherby, she moved on to the village shop, where Mrs. Hubbard presided over shelves of tinned goods and gossip. The shop was busy, with 2 women whispering near the counter and a young boy eyeing the sweets. Miss Marple purchased a skein of wool, using the transaction to ease into conversation. "Such a peaceful village," she remarked, "though I hear there was a bit of excitement last night." Mrs. Hubbard's eyebrows shot up. "Excitement? That's one way to put it. My sister-in-law saw a man near the church, bold as brass, just standing there in the shadows. She said he had a queer look about him, like he was waiting for someone. Gave her quite a turn." "Did she see where he went?" Miss Marple asked, adjusting her spectacles. "Vanished into the night," she said. "By the time she fetched her husband, there was no sign of him. Mind you, she's not one for fancies, my sister-in-law. If she says she saw something, she saw it." Miss Marple murmured her thanks and stepped outside, pausing to consider. The accounts were consistent. A tall man, possibly a stranger, seen near the churchyard at dusk. The shoe, with its lavender scent and pristine condition, suggested a woman's presence. Yet no one had mentioned a female companion. Had the stranger left the shoe, or was it a relic of another's passing? Her final stop was the tea shop, where the village's knitting circle convened. The ladies greeted her warmly, their needles clicking as they exchanged tidbits. Miss Marple listened, guiding the conversation with gentle nudges. Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks flushed from a second scorn, mentioned a rumour of a ghostly figure near the church, though she admitted it was likely exaggerated. Another woman, Miss Hartnell, spoke of an odd silence in the village last night, as if the birds themselves had held their breath. As Miss Marple sipped her tea, she pieced together the fragments. A stranger, a shoe, a churchyard, and a village on edge. The shoe remained her anchor, its presence too deliberate to ignore. Whoever had left it had done so with purpose, and the stranger's shadowy movements suggested a connection. She would need to visit the churchyard herself, perhaps at dusk, to see what secrets it held. Rising to leave, Miss Marple smiled at the circle. "Such a charming village," she said, "but even the quietest places have their stories." The ladies nodded, unaware that she was already unravelling one. Chapter 3. The Scent of Lavender. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, painting the rolling hills in hues of amber and gold. Miss Jane Marple, her cloth bag with the mysterious shoe tucked under her arm, walked briskly along the winding lane that led to Grey Manor, the secluded estate of Mrs. Lavinia Grey. The air was thick with the hum of bees and the sweet, heady aroma of lavender, which grew in meticulously tended rows along the manor's perimeter. The scent, so evocative of the shoe's faint trace, had drawn Miss Marple here, her instincts whispering that this was no mere coincidence. Grey Manor stood at the edge of the village, its ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys exuding an air of faded grandeur. Mrs. Grey, a widow of some years, was known for her reclusive habits and her passion for her lavender gardens, which supplied the village with sachets and oils. Few were invited past the wrought-iron gates, and fewer still spoke of what lay within. Miss Marple, however, was not easily deterred. Armed with a pretext, a request for lavender cuttings for her own garden, she approached the gate and rang. The bell, a young maid, her apron slightly askew, answered after a long pause. "Mrs. Grey's not expecting visitors," she said, her eyes darting nervously toward the house. Miss Marple smiled warmly, her demeanour as unthreatening as a spring breeze. "I shan't take much of her time, my dear. I'm Jane Marple, from Rose Cottage. I've heard such wonderful things about Mrs. Grey's lavender, and I thought she might spare a cutting or two for an old woman's garden." The maid hesitated, then nodded, leading Miss Marple through the gate and up a gravel path lined with lavender bushes. Their purple spikes swayed gently, releasing bursts of fragrance that enveloped the air. Miss Marple noted the precision of the rows, each plant trimmed with care, and the absence of weeds, a testament to either Mrs. Grey's diligence or a well-paid gardener. Yet there was something else, a subtle tension in the stillness, as if the garden itself were holding its breath. The maid ushered her into a drawing-room that smelled of polished wood and dried flowers. The furniture was heavy, Victorian, and the curtains were drawn halfway, casting the room in a muted glow. Mrs. Lavinia Grey sat in a high-backed chair, her silver hair pinned tightly, and her black dress crisp despite the warmth of the day. She rose as Miss Marple entered, her movements graceful but guarded, like a cat assessing an intruder. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice cool but polite. "An unexpected pleasure. I understand you're here about my lavender." "Indeed, Mrs. Grey," Miss Marple replied, settling into the offered seat. "Your gardens are the talk of St. Mary Mead. I thought a few cuttings might brighten my little patch, and perhaps we might have a chat. Village life can be so quiet, don't you find?" Mrs. Grey's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Quiet, yes. I prefer it that way." She rang a bell, and the maid reappeared with a tray of tea and biscuits. As the girl poured, Miss Marple observed her hostess. Mrs. Grey's hands, though steady, gripped the armrests of her chair a fraction too tightly, and her eyes flicked toward the window at the faintest sound. A creak of the house, a rustle of leaves. The conversation began lightly, with talk of lavender varieties and soil conditions. Miss Marple, ever adept at steering dialogue, mentioned the shoe almost casually. "I found the most curious thing on my path this morning," she said, sipping her tea. "A single shoe, quite elegant, with a hint of lavender about it. I don't. Suppose you've misplaced one, or perhaps seen someone who might have." Mrs. Grey's cup paused halfway to her lips, a fleeting tremor betraying her composure. "A shoe," she said, her tone too even. "How odd. No, I've lost nothing of the sort, and I've seen no one. I seldom leave the estate these days." Missy Marple nodded, her expression one of mild interest. "Of course, it's likely nothing, though the lavender scent did make me think of your gardens. Such a distinctive fragrance, don't you agree? It clings to everything it touches." Mrs. Grey set her cup down, the clink loud in the quiet room. "Lavender does linger," she said, her voice tight, "but it's common enough. Half the village uses my sachets." She shifted, her fingers smoothing the fabric of her dress. "You'll forgive me, Miss Marple, but I've a headache coming on. The maid will fetch your cuttings." Miss Marple rose, thanking her hostess with practised warmth. As the maid led her back through the garden, she took a closer look at the surroundings. A stone path branched off toward a gated section of the estate, where the lavender grew denser, almost wild. Beyond it, she glimpsed a small shed, its door secured with a heavy padlock. The maid, noticing her gaze, quickened her pace. "Here's your cuttings, miss," the girl said, thrusting a small bundle of lavender stalks into Miss Marple's hands. Her eyes were wide, her voice hushed. "Best not linger. Mrs. Grey don't like it." Miss Marple thanked her and made her way back to the lane, the lavender's scent mingling with her thoughts. Mrs. Grey's reaction had been subtle, but unmistakable. A flash of unease, a hurried dismissal. The shoe's lavender trace, so specific, to this garden suggested a connection, yet Mrs. Grey had denied any knowledge. And that locked shed, tucked away like a secret, what did it conceal? As she walked home, the sun dipping below the hills, Miss Marple considered the village whispers about a stranger near the churchyard. Could they be linked to Grey Manor? Mrs. Grey's isolation, her nervous demeanour, and the lavender all pointed to a thread in the mystery, one she would tug gently but firmly. For now, she would keep the shoe close and her suspicions closer, certain that the scent of lavender would lead her further along the trail. Chapter 4. Footprints in the Mist. The evening settled over St. Mary Mead like a soft grey veil, the air heavy with the promise of mist. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped snugly over her shoulders, stood at the edge of her garden, the mysterious shoe now safely stowed in her cottage. The faint scent of lavender from her visit to Grey Manor still clung to her senses, urging her onward. The shoe's placement on her path and Mrs. Gray's guarded demeanour had deepened her curiosity, and the village whispers of a stranger near the churchyard pointed her toward the moor beyond, a place where secrets might linger in the fog. Armed with a sturdy walking stick and a small torch, Miss Marple set out along the cobblestone path, retracing the route from her gate to the lane. The shoe had been left precisely where the path curved, and she suspected its placement was no accident. She examined the ground again, her torch casting a narrow beam across the stones. The dew had softened the earth, and there, faint but unmistakable, were the impressions of footprints, small, like those of a woman, leading away from the shoe's resting place toward the open moor. The footprints were shallow, the edges blurred by time and weather, but they held a deliberate rhythm, as if the wearer had walked with purpose rather than panic. Miss Marple followed them, her steps cautious, her eyes scanning the darkening landscape. The lane gave way to a dirt track, and the footprints grew fainter, pressed into the grass that bordered the moor. The churchyard lay to her left, its ancient yews looming like silent sentinels, but the trail veered right, towards the vast undulating expanse where mist curled like smoke. The moor was not a place villagers ventured lightly, especially at dusk. Its bogs and sudden drops were the stuff of local lore, and Miss Marple, though practical, felt the weight of its eerie quiet. The mist thickened as she walked, muffling the distant bleat of sheep and the rustle of her own footsteps. The footprints, now barely discernible, led her to a low rise where the grass gave way to patches of bare earth. Here the trail grew erratic, as if the walker had hesitated or turned, and then it stopped abruptly near an old stone well, its moss-covered rim crumbling into the soil. Miss Marple paused, her torch sweeping the area. The well was ancient, its depths hidden by shadow, and the ground around it was disturbed, the grass flattened in places. She knelt, careful not to smudge the earth, and noticed a faint glint in the soil, a scrap of fabric, torn and caught on a thorn. She extracted it gently with her handkerchief, holding it to the light. It was silk, deep blue and frayed at the edges, not unlike the material of a fine dress or scarf. It bore no trace of lavender, and its texture was unlike the shoe's leather, suggesting it belonged to another piece of the puzzle. She tucked the fabric into her pocket and circled the well, her mind racing. The footprints had led her here, but their sudden end was troubling. Had the walker been met by someone? Or had they deliberately obscured their trail? The well itself drew her attention, its dark mouth a silent witness. She leaned over, shining, her torch downward, but saw only the glint of water far below. A faint musty odour rose, mingling with the mist, but there was no sign of anything or anyone within. Miss Marple straightened, her thoughts turning to the stranger seen near the churchyard. The well was not far from that sacred ground, perhaps a 10-minute walk, and the timing of the sightings aligned with the shoe's appearance. Could the stranger have followed the same path, or left the shoe as a marker? The scrap of fabric complicated matters. Its presence suggested a second person, or perhaps a struggle, though the footprints showed no signs of violence. The mist was growing denser, curling around her ankles, and the temperature had dropped sharply. Miss Marple knew better than to linger. The moor was treacherous in the dark, and she had gathered enough for one evening. She retraced her steps, marking the well's location in her mind. The footprints, the fabric, and the well formed a constellation of clues, each pointing to a story yet untold. The shoe, with its lavender scent, remained the anchor, but this new trail suggested a broader canvas, a woman's journey, a stranger's shadow, and a well that might hold more than water. As she reached the lane, the church bell tolled faintly, its sound swallowed by the fog. Miss Marple glanced back at the moor, now a sea of grey, and felt a shiver that was not entirely from the cold. "A trail indeed," she murmured, clutching the scrap of fabric in her pocket. Tomorrow she would revisit the churchyard and speak to those who had seen the stranger. For now, the moor had given her what it could, and she would carry its secrets home. Chapter 5. The Locked Diary. The morning after her venture to the misty moor, Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy parlour, the single shoe resting on a side table, and the scrap of blue silk carefully folded beside it. The faint lavender scent from the shoe lingered in her memory, as did the abrupt end of the footprints near the old well. Her findings had deepened the mystery, and she felt the need to anchor her thoughts in the village's quieter corners. The St. Mary Mead Library, a small but well-kept repository of books and local history, seemed the perfect place to seek answers, or at least new questions. Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, tucking the shoe and fabric into her cloth bag for safekeeping. The library was a short walk, nestled between the village hall and the baker's shop, its stone facade softened by climbing roses. Inside, the air smelled of aged paper and polish, and Miss Finch, the librarian, greeted her with a nod. "Miss Marple, always a pleasure," she said, adjusting her spectacles. "Looking for anything in particular?" "Oh, just browsing, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone light. "Though I wouldn't mind a look at any local records or donated books. You never know what stories they might tell." Miss Finch pointed her toward a corner where recent donations were stacked, still unsorted. "We've had a few boxes from the vicarage," she said. "Old novels mostly, but some journals and such. Help yourself." Miss Marple settled at a wooden table, her fingers brushing over the spines of worn books. The collection was eclectic, dog-eared. Romances, gardening manuals, and a few crumbling hymnals. She worked methodically, flipping through pages for notes or inscriptions that might hint at the shoe's owner or the stranger's purpose. Halfway through a faded copy of Persuasion, her fingers caught on something wedged between the pages, a slim, leather-bound diary, its cover embossed with the initials C.W. Her pulse quickened. The diary was small, no larger than a prayer book, and secured with a tarnished brass lock. It was worn but intact, the leather soft from handling, and it bore no trace of lavender or the moor's dampness. Miss Marple turned it over, noting a faint watermark on the back, a stationer's mark from a shop in London, dated some 10 years prior. The lock was simple but sturdy, and without a key, the diary's secrets would remain hidden for now. She glanced around the library, ensuring Miss Finch was occupied, then slipped the diary into her bag. It was not theft, she reasoned. She would return it once its contents were understood. For now, it was a clue, and clues belonged in her care. She continued browsing, but her thoughts were fixed on the diary and its initials, C.W., a name, perhaps, or a code. The village had no prominent families with those initials, but St. Mary Mead had seen its share of visitors and transients over the years. As she left the library, Miss Marple's mind turned to a memory. From a decade ago, a whisper of scandal that had faded with time. A young woman, Clara Winthrop, had lived briefly with her aunt in the village before vanishing without explanation. The aunt had claimed Clara returned to London, but the abruptness of her departure had sparked gossip. Could C.W. be Clara Winthrop? And if so, How did her diary connect to a shoe, a stranger, and a scrap of silk? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple examined the diary under the light of her reading lamp. The lock resisted her gentle prodding with a hairpin, but the cover yielded a faint inscription nearly worn away. To Clara, with love. The handwriting was feminine, looping, and the ink had faded to a ghostly blue. She set the diary aside and retrieved the shoe, comparing it to the diary's era. The shoe was modern, its style no more than a year or two old, while the diary was older, its pages yellowed. The connection, if it existed, was not immediate. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the moor and the well. The footprints had suggested a woman's presence, and the scrap of silk hinted at another figure. If Clara Winthrop was tied to the diary, her story might illuminate the shoe's purpose, or the stranger's. She recalled the village gossip about Clara's time in St. Mary Mead, a quiet girl, fond of sketching, who kept to herself, but was seen walking with a young man, a visitor whose name no one could recall. The whispers had hinted at a romance, perhaps forbidden, and Clara's sudden departure had fueled speculation of heartbreak or disgrace. The diary, locked though it was, felt like a key in itself. Miss Marple resolved to find a way to open it, perhaps by consulting Mr. Hodges, the village jeweller, who had a knack for small mechanisms. She also decided to revisit Clara's aunt, Miss Winthrop, who still lived in a cottage near the churchyard. The old woman was frail and reclusive, but her memory might hold fragments of Clara's story. As she prepared her tea, Miss Marple glanced at the diary, its lock glinting faintly. "Clara," she murmured, "what did you leave behind?" "The jar, shoe, the silk, the footprints, and now the diary." They were threads in a tapestry, and she was determined to weave them together. The village, with its quiet lanes and hidden stories, was speaking, and Miss Marple was listening. Chapter 6. Shadows. At dusk, the twilight air in St. Mary Mead carried a chill, the kind that seeped into the bones and sharpened the senses. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl wrapped tightly and her sturdy shoes laced, stepped out of her cottage as the last light bled from the sky. The locked diary, the mysterious shoe, the scrap of blue silk, and the footprints leading to the moors. Old Well had woven a web of questions, and the village whispers of a stranger near the churchyard tugged at her curiosity. Night, she resolved to visit the churchyard herself, hoping to catch a glimpse of the elusive figure or uncover a clue to tie her findings together. The lane to the church was quiet. The cottages shuttered against the evening. Miss Marple moved with purpose, her walking stick tapping softly on the gravel, her torch tucked in her pocket, but unlit to avoid drawing attention. The churchyard, bordered by ancient yew trees and weathered gravestones, lay just beyond the vicarage, its iron gate creaking faintly in the breeze. She paused at the gate, her eyes adjusting to the dimness, and listened. The village was still, save for the distant hoot of an owl and the rustle of leaves. Slipping through the gate, Miss Marple kept to the shadows, her steps careful on the uneven path. The church loomed ahead, its spire a dark silhouette against the fading sky. She recalled the gossip, Billy Price's sighting of a tall man, Elsie's glimpse of a figure near the vicarage, and Mr. Giles's claim of footsteps on gravel. The churchyard was the nexus of these accounts, and its proximity to her cottage and the moor made it a likely stage for whatever drama had left the shoe behind. She circled toward the yew trees where Billy had seen the stranger, and crouched to examine the ground. The earth was soft from recent rain, but any footprints had been obscured by the comings and goings of villagers. She was about to move on when a low murmur reached her ears. Voices, hushed and urgent, coming from the far side of the churchyard near a cluster of older graves. Miss Marple froze, her heart quickening, and edged closer, using the yews for cover. Peering through the branches, she saw two figures standing close together, their outlines blurred by the gathering dusk. One was tall, perhaps a man, his hat pulled low, as Miss Weatherby had described. The other was shorter, their features indistinct, but their posture suggested agitation, hands gesturing sharply. The taller figure spoke, his voice too low to catch fully, but Miss Marple strained to hear fragments. "And the grave cannot stay," the shorter figure replied, their tone sharp. "Her shoe, if they find it." Miss Marple's breath caught. The mention of a shoe and a grave sent a shiver through her, linking the conversation directly to her own discoveries. She shifted slightly, trying to see their faces, but her foot brushed against a loose stone, sending it skittering across the path. The sound, though faint, was enough. The figures froze, their heads turning toward her hiding place. Miss Marple held her breath, pressing herself against the yew, its needles pricking her shawl. "Who's there?" the taller figure called, his voice sharp with suspicion. The shorter one grabbed his arm, whispering something, and they moved quickly, retreating toward the churchyard's back gate. Miss Marjingzipiel waited, her heart pounding, until their footsteps faded. She stepped out, her torch now flickering to life, and scanned the ground where they had stood. The grass was trampled, and near a lichen-covered gravestone, she spotted a small object glinting in the beam, a silver cigarette case, its surface scratched but engraved with the initials J.H. She hesitated, then picked it up with her handkerchief, her mind racing. The case was a new clue, but her near discovery had cost her the chance to identify the figures. She tucked the case into her pocket, alongside the scrap of silk, and retraced her steps to the main path. The churchyard was silent again, but the weight of what she had overheard pressed heavily on her. Her shoe and the grave were no idle phrases. They pointed to a secret tied to the shoe on her path, and perhaps to Clara Winthrop, whose diary remained locked in her cottage. As she reached the gate, Miss Marple glanced back at the churchyard, its shadows deeper now. The cigarette case, the voices, and the mention of a grave were threads in the same tapestry as the shoe, the diary, and the footprints. The stranger or strangers knew more than they wished to reveal, and their secrecy suggested danger. She resolved to speak to Reverend Clements, who might know of a J.H. in the parish, and to press Miss Winthrop for more about Clara's past. The walk home was swift, the night closing in. Miss Marple locked her door and placed the cigarette case beside the diary, their initials, C.W. and J.H., staring back like pieces of a puzzle. "And shadows at dusk," she murmured, "but shadows always lead to light." She would need to tread carefully, for the trail was growing darker, and the grave, whatever it held, was closer than she had feared. Chapter 7. The Parson's Confession. Morning sun struggled through a veil of clouds, casting a muted light over St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the vicarage. The events of the previous evening in the churchyard, the hushed voices mentioning her shoe and the grave, the silver cigarette case marked J.H., weighed heavily on her mind. The clues were mounting. The single shoe, the scrap of blue silk, Clara Winthrop's locked diary, and now this new artifact. Each piece hinted at a story buried in the village's quiet lanes, and Miss Marple sensed the church with its ancient stones and secrets, held a key to unravelling it. The vicarage, a tidy house beside the church, was surrounded by a garden where roses battled the autumn chill. Miss Marple knocked, and Reverend Clements himself answered, his face lined with the gentle weariness of a man who carried his flock's burdens. "Miss Marple," he said, his smile warm but strained. "What a pleasant surprise! Do come in." She followed him into a study cluttered with books and papers, the air smelling of ink and old leather. A fire crackled in the grate, and Reverend Clements gestured to a worn armchair. "Tea?" he offered, but Miss Marple declined with a polite wave, her eyes already scanning the room for hints of the initials J.H., a photograph, a letter, anything. "I shan't keep you long, Reverend," she began, settling into the chair. "I've been troubled by some odd goings-on in the village. You'll have heard the talk of a stranger near the churchyard, I expect." Reverend Clements nodded, his fingers fidgeting with a pen. "Yes, the gossip has reached me. Young Billy, Price and others have been quite vocal. It's unsettling, though I suspect it's more imagination than fact." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. "Perhaps. But I was in the churchyard myself last evening and overheard something curious. 2 voices, speaking of a shoe and a grave. It put me in mind of a single shoe I found on my path, quite out of place. I wondered if you'd heard anything similar, perhaps in your pastoral duties." The Reverend's face paled, his hand stilling on the pen. For a moment he seemed to wrestle with himself, his eyes darting to the window as if expecting an eavesdropper. Then he sighed, a sound heavy with reluctance. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "you have a way of seeing through the ordinary. I suppose I should tell you, though it pains me to break a confidence, even in part." Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze steady but kind. "You needn't betray your vows, Reverend. Only share what you feel is right. If there's harm afoot, we must act to prevent it." He nodded, his shoulders sagging. "Last week, during that dreadful storm, someone came to the church late at night. I was in the vestry, sorting hymnals, when I heard a knock. I found no one at the door, but a voice, muffled as if through a scarf, spoke from the shadows. They asked for confession, but not in the usual way. They stood outside, refusing to enter, and I listened through the cracked door." Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her face remained serene. "What did they confess?" Reverend Clements hesitated, choosing his words with care. "They spoke of guilt, of a wrong done long ago. They mentioned a burial, not in consecrated ground, but somewhere hidden. They said it haunted them, that they could still see her face. I pressed for details, urging them to seek peace, but they grew agitated and left before I could learn more. I never saw their face, and I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman." Miss Marple's mind raced. A burial, a hidden place, a face that haunted. The words echoed the churchyard conversation and the clues she held. Did they mention a shoe or perhaps a name? Anything to identify them? He shook his head. No names, no specifics. Only that the burden was heavy, and they feared discovery. I've preyed on it since, wondering if I should have done more, but the seal of confession, even in such strange circumstances, binds me." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the cigarette case. She considered showing it to him, but held back. The initials J.H. might mean nothing, or they might startle him into silence. Instead, she asked, "Have you known anyone in the parish with the initials J.H.? A visitor, perhaps, or someone from years past?" Reverend Clements frowned, thinking. "J.H.? Not that I recall. There was a John Harrow, a gardener who worked at Grey Manor years ago, but he left after a season. I don't know if he's still about. Why do you ask?" "Just a passing thought," Miss Marple said lightly, filing the name away. "John Harrow, J.H., a possible link to Mrs. Grey's estate and its lavender-scented secrets. You've been most helpful, Reverend. I shan't trouble you further, but if you hear anything more, you'll let me know." He agreed, his relief evident, and saw her to the door. As Miss Marple stepped into the garden, the clouds parted, casting a brief shaft of sunlight across the churchyard. She glanced at the yew trees where she had hidden, then at the older graves where the voices had spoken. The reverend story of a confession tied the threads tighter. Clara Winthrop's diary, the shoe, the silk, the footprints, and now a buried secret. She resolved to pursue the name John Harrow, perhaps through Mrs. Grey or village records, and to open the diary, which might hold Clara's own confessions. The cigarette case, with its scratched initials, felt heavy in her pocket. A reminder that the stranger or strangers were close, their shadows lengthening over St. Mary Mead. "A grave," she murmured, her eyes on the churchyard. But whose? The answer, she sensed, was near, and she would find it, one careful step at a time. Chapter 8. A glint in the soil. The late morning in St. Mary Mead was crisp, with a breeze that rustled the last of the autumn leaves. Miss Jane Marple knelt in her garden, her trowel turning the soil near her rose bushes. The revelations of the past days, the locked diary of Clara Winthrop, the cigarette case marked J.H., the overheard talk of a grave, and Reverend Clemence's account of a secret confession had sharpened her resolve. The single shoe with its lavender scent remained the heart of the mystery, but each new clue seemed to pull her closer to a truth buried in the village's quiet corners. As she worked, her thoughts drifted to John Harrow, the gardener Reverend Clemence had mentioned, whose initials matched the cigarette case. A connection to Grey Manor, with its lavender gardens, and Mrs. Grey's unease seemed likely. But she needed more to tie him to Clara, or the shoe. Her plan for the day included a visit to Mr. Hodges, the jeweller, to unlock the diary, and a discreet inquiry about Harrow at the village shop. For now, though, she tended her garden, finding clarity in the rhythm of digging and planting. She was loosening the soil near her garden gate, the very spot where the shoe had appeared, when her trowel struck something hard. A faint metallic glint caught her eye, half buried in the dark earth. Miss Marple paused, her heart quickening, and set the trowel aside. With gloved fingers, she carefully brushed away the soil, revealing a small heart-shaped locket. Its silver, surface tarnished but intact. She lifted it gently, holding it to the sunlight. The locket was engraved with the initials C.W., and a delicate clasp suggested it could be opened, though it resisted her initial tug. Miss Marple sat back on her heels, the locket cradled in her palm. The initials matched those on Clara Winthrop's diary, a coincidence too striking to dismiss. The locket's presence in her garden, so near the shoe, suggested a deliberate act. Someone had left these items for her to find, or they had been dropped in haste. She examined the surrounding soil, but found no other disturbances, no footprints or scraps of fabric like those on the moor. The earth was soft, recently turned, as if the locket had been buried shallowly and uncovered by her gardening. Rising, she carried the locket inside, placing it beside the diary, the shoe, the scrap of blue silk, and the cigarette case. The growing, collection of clues felt like a map, each item a marker on a trail leading to a hidden truth. She tried the locket's clasp again, but it held fast, likely rusted from time in the ground. Like the diary, it would need Mr. Hodges's skill, and she resolved to take both to him that afternoon. As she cleaned the locket with a soft cloth, Miss Marple considered its significance. Lockets often held photographs or mementos, tokens of love or loss. If it belonged to Clara Winthrop, it might contain a picture of the young man rumoured to have courted her, or perhaps a lock of hair, a clue to her fate. The locket's burial near her gate suggested someone knew Miss Marple's habit of noticing details. A taunt, a plea, or an accident. The shoe, too, had been placed with care, its lavender scent pointing to Grey Manor. Could the locket be another thread tying Clara to Mrs. Grey or to John Harrow? Her thoughts turned to the confession Reverend Clements had overheard. A burial in unconsecrated ground, a face that haunted the confessor. The locket, buried like a secret, echoed that imagery. Was Clara herself the one buried, or was she the confessor, haunted by another's fate? The cigarette case, with its J.H. initials, hinted at Harrow's involvement, but the blue silk and the footprints suggested others might be entangled in the web. Miss Marple wrapped the locket in her handkerchief and placed it in her bag alongside the diary. She glanced out her window, where the garden gate stood open, the path beyond leading to the lane, and the wider village. St. Mary Mead seemed peaceful, its cottages and hedgerows unchanged, but beneath that calm lay a current of unease. The churchyard, voices, the moor's well, the lavender estate, all were points on a map she was beginning to chart. Before heading to Mr. Hodges, she paused to consider her next steps. The locket's discovery felt like a turning point, a sign that the trail was growing warmer. She would ask Miss Winthrop, Clara's aunt, about the locket and any connection to John Harrow. She would also revisit the churchyard, perhaps in daylight, to search the older graves where the voices had spoken. The mention of a grave, paired with the locket's burial, suggested a literal or symbolic act of concealment, and Miss Marple was determined to unearth it. As she locked her cottage door, the locket's weight in her bag was a reminder of the stakes. C.W., she murmured, her eyes on the path where the shoe had appeared. You left a trail, my dear, and I shall follow it. The glint in the soil had illuminated the mystery, and Miss Marple felt the threads of the tapestry tightening, drawing her closer to the heart of St. Mary Mead's secrets. Chapter 9. The Stranger's Return. The afternoon in St. Mary Mead was overcast, the sky a patchwork of grey that dulled the village's usual charm. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlour, the locket with C.W., initials now cleaned and resting beside Clara Winthrop's locked diary, the single shoe, the scrap of blue silk, and the cigarette case marked J.H. Her visit to Mr. Hodges, the jeweller, was planned for later that day to unlock the diary and lock it. But the morning's discovery of the locket in her garden had sharpened her focus. The clues were converging. Footprints to the moor's well, whispers of a grave, a confession of a hidden burial, and now a tangible link to Clara. Yet the stranger seen in the churchyard remained a shadow, and Miss Marple sensed their role was pivotal. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She rose, smoothing her cardigan, and found Mrs. Bantry, her face flushed with excitement. "Jane, you'll never guess," she exclaimed, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "There's a new man in the village, a historian, he says, come to study our folklore. He's at the Blue Boar, asking all sorts of questions. I thought you'd want to know. What with that shoe and all the odd talk?" Miss Marple's interest sparked. "A historian? How curious. What's his name, Dolly?" "Mr. Harrow," Mrs. Bantry said, lowering her voice as if the name itself were a secret. "James Harrow, tall, rather brooding, with a hat he keeps pulled low. He's been asking about the moor and the old well, of all things. Mrs. Hubbard says he's charming but peculiar. Keeps to himself when he's not prying." The name struck like a bell. Harrow, J-A-H, the initials on the cigarette case. Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind raced. John Harrow, the gardener from Grey Manor years ago, shared those initials, and now a James Harrow appeared, inquiring about the very well where her footprints had led. Coincidence was unlikely. This stranger's return felt like a thread pulling the mystery taut. "Thank you, Dolly," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "I may pop by the Blue Boar myself. A historian in St. Mary Mead is worth a chat." Mrs. Bantry, satisfied with her gossip, bustled off, leaving Miss Marple to plan her approach. A direct meeting with Mr. Harrow could reveal much, but she would need to tread carefully. His questions about the well suggested he knew more than he let on. She gathered her bag, including the cigarette case, and set out for the village centre. The Blue Boar, the local inn, was a cosy establishment with low beams and a fire always burning. As she entered, the hum of conversation paused, heads turning to nod at her. She spotted a man at a corner table, his back to the wall, a notebook open before him. He was tall, as Billy Price had described, with dark hair and a hat resting beside his glass. His eyes, sharp and guarded, flicked up as she approached, but he offered a polite smile. "Mr. Harrow, I presume," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but probing. "I'm Jane Marple, a local. I hear you're studying our village's folklore. May I join you?" He hesitated, then gestured to the chair opposite. "Miss Marple, of course. Please sit. I'm James Harrow, here to research old tales, wells, moors, that sort of thing." His voice was smooth, but his fingers tapped the notebook, betraying a hint of unease. Miss Marple settled, her hands folded neatly. "The moor's well is an odd choice," she remarked. "Not much folklore there, unless you count children's stories about lost travellers. What draws you to it?" Harrow's smile tightened. "Just a mention in an old journal I found in, London. Said the well was a meeting place once, maybe for secret dealings. I'm chasing threads, you see. Local history is full of surprises." He leaned back, his gaze steady but evasive, avoiding her eyes when she mentioned the well directly. She nodded, her mind cataloguing his words. A journal, secret meetings. His story was plausible but vague, and his interest in the well too precise to be casual. She decided to test him. "The village has been lively lately," she said. "Talk of a stranger near the churchyard, and I found a curious shoe on my path. It's made us all a bit watchful. You haven't noticed anything odd, have you?" Harrow's hand stilled on his notebook, his expression flickering for a moment before he recovered. "A shoe? How strange." "No, I've seen nothing out of the ordinary. I keep to my work mostly." He glanced at his watch a touch too quickly. "I'm afraid I have an appointment, Miss Marple. It's been a pleasure." He rose, gathering his notebook and hat, and left with a nod. Miss Marple watched him go, noting the stiffness in his stride. He had deflected her questions with practised ease, but his reaction to the shoe and his haste to leave spoke volumes. The cigarette case in her bag, with its J.H. initials, felt heavier now. Was James Harrow the same J.H. as John Harrow, or another piece of the puzzle? As she sipped her tea at the inn, Miss Marple reflected on the encounter. Harrow's arrival so soon after her discoveries was no accident. His focus on the well tied him to the footprints, and his unease at the mention of the shoe suggested a connection to the churchyard voices. She would need to learn more about his past, perhaps through Mrs. Gray, who might recall John Harrow, or village records. The diary and locket, still locked, might also hold answers, and her visit to Mr. Hodges was now urgent. Stepping outside, Miss Marple glanced at the churchyard across the lane. Harrow's shadow loomed larger than the stranger's now. His return, a signal that the trail was warming. "James Harrow," she murmured, her eyes narrowing. "What are you chasing? And why here?" The village, with its secrets buried in soil and stone, was stirring, and Miss Marple was ready to meet its ghosts. Chapter 10. Echoes from the Past. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the table where her collection of clues lay. The single shoe with its lavender scent, Clara, Winthrop's locked diary, the locket engraved with C.W., the scrap of blue silk, and the cigarette case marked J.H. The arrival of James Harrow, with his probing questions about the Moor's Well and his unease at the mention of the shoe, had tightened the threads of the mystery. Miss Marple's encounter with him at the Blue Boar had confirmed her suspicions. He was no mere historian, and his presence in St. Mary Mead was tied to the secrets she was unravelling. Her visit to Mr. Hodges, the jeweller, had been delayed by Mrs. Bantry's gossip, but Miss Marple resolved to go that evening to unlock the diary and locket. For now, she turned her attention to Clara Winthrop's aunt, Miss Eleanor Winthrop, a frail recluse who lived in a cottage near the churchyard. If anyone could shed light on Clara's life and the locket's significance, it was her. Miss Marple donned her coat, tucked the locket into her bag for reference, and set out, her walking stick tapping a steady rhythm on the lane. Miss Winthrop's cottage was small, its garden overgrown with nettles and ivy, a stark contrast to the neat hedges of St. Mary Mead. The shutters were half closed, giving the house a sleepy, forgotten air. Miss Marple knocked, and after a long pause, the door creaked open to reveal Miss Winthrop, her thin frame wrapped in a shawl, her eyes watery but sharp. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice reedy, "I don't often have visitors. What brings you?" "A matter of nostalgia, Miss Winthrop," Miss Marple replied, her smile gentle. "I've been thinking of your niece Clara, and her time in the village. I wondered if we might talk about her." Miss Winthrop's expression tightened, but she stepped aside, gesturing to a cluttered parlour. The room smelled of damp and lavender sachets, and a single photograph of a young woman, Clara, presumably, sat on the mantel, her face serious but striking. Miss Marple settled into a creaky chair, noting the photograph's resemblance to the diary's era. "Clara was a lovely girl," she began. "Such a pity she left so suddenly. Do you ever hear from her?" Miss Winthrop's hands trembled as she poured tea from a chipped pot. "Clara? No, not in years. She went to London to make her own way. Young girls do that. She wrote once or twice, then nothing." Her voice wavered, and she avoided Miss Marple's gaze, focusing on the tea. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her tone soft but probing. "I remember the village talk, how Clara was fond of sketching, always out on the moor or by the churchyard. There was a young man, wasn't there? Someone she walked with?" Miss Winthrop's cup rattled in its saucer. Gossip, she said sharply. People talk nonsense. Clara kept to herself mostly. If she walked with anyone, it was her business. But her fingers twisted the shawl, betraying her unease. Sensing an opening, Miss Marple reached into her bag and produced the locket, holding it delicately. "I found this in my garden," she said. "It has the initials C.W. I thought it might be Clara's. Does it look familiar?" Miss Winthrop's eyes widened, her breath catching. She reached for the locket, then pulled back, as if it burned. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "It's hers, Clara's. I gave it to her for her 18th birthday. She wore it always, with a picture of her mother inside." Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her tone steady. "How curious it ended up in my garden. Do you know how it might have come there, or why Clara would part with it?" Miss Winthrop shook her head, tears welling. "I don't know. She was here one day, gone the next. She left a letter, said she had to leave, that it wasn't safe. Something about a promise and a place no one must find. I thought she meant London, but now—" Her voice trailed off, and she stared at the locket, lost in memory. "A promise?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "Did she say to whom, or where this place was?" "No, nothing clear. She was frightened, that's all I know. She wouldn't talk about it. I kept her letter, but it's just ramblings, nothing to make sense of." Miss Winthrop pointed to a small bureau. "It's in there if you want to see it. I can't bear to read it again." Miss Marple crossed to the bureau, her movements careful. Inside a drawer, among faded ribbons and receipts, was a single sheet of paper, folded and yellowed. She unfolded it, revealing Clara's handwriting, hurried and uneven. "Auntie, I must go. It's not safe here any more. I made a promise, and it's led me to a place no one must find. Forgive me for leaving like this. I'll write when I can. Clara." The letter was vague, but its tone, fearful, urgent, echoed the confession reverend. Clemence had overheard, and the churchyard voices mentioning a grave. Miss Marple folded it carefully, returning it to the drawer. "May I borrow this, Miss Winthrop? I'll return it soon." Miss Winthrop nodded, her eyes distant. "Take it. If it helps find what happened to her, take it." Miss Marple thanked her and rose, the locket and letter now in her possession. As she left the cottage, the church bell tolled, its sound carrying across the village. Clara's fear, her promise, and a hidden place wove into the tapestry of clues: the shoe, the diary, the cigarette case, the well, and James Harrow's sudden return. The locket confirmed Clara's presence in the mystery, and the letter hinted at a secret she had fled to protect or escape. Miss Marple's steps quickened as she headed for Mr. Hodges's shop. The diary and locket needed opening, and Harrow's connection to John Harrow, the gardener, required investigation. The echoes of Clara's past were growing louder, and Miss Marple felt the trail leading her closer to truth. A truth tied to a promise, a place, and perhaps a grave. Chapter 11. The Shallow Grave. The early morning mist hung low over the moor, cloaking St. Mary Mead in a ghostly hush. Miss Jane Marple, her walking stick in hand and her bag heavy with purpose, set out before dawn, driven by the weight of her latest discoveries. The visit to Mr. Hodges the previous evening had been fruitful. Clara Winthrop's diary and locket were now unlocked, their contents revealing fragments of a story that echoed the village's whispers. The diary spoke of Clara's love for a man named Jay, her fear of discovery, and a place where secrets sleep. The locket held a faded photograph of a young man, his features blurred, but his initials, J.H. etched on the back, matching the cigarette case. Clara's letter, with its mention of a promise and a hidden place, pointed Miss Marple back to the moor, where the footprints had ended near the old well. The clues, the lavender-scented shoe, the scrap of blue silk, the cigarette case, the diary, the locket, and the churchyard voices speaking of a grave, converged on the moor. Miss Marple's encounter with James Harrow, whose initials and interest in the well marked him as a key figure, had heightened her urgency. The confession Reverend Clements overheard of a burial in unconsecrated ground, and Clara's aunt's tale of her niece's fear suggested a literal grave, one Miss Marple was determined to find. She followed the same path as before, the dirt track leading from the village to the moor's edge. The mist muffled her steps, and the air was sharp with the scent of damp earth. She passed the well, its stone rim glistening with dew, and continued deeper into the moor, guided by a passage. In Clara's diary, "Beyond the well, where the gorse grows thick, I hid what must stay buried." Miss Marple's eyes scanned the landscape, noting a dense patch of gorse bushes some distance from the well, their yellow blooms stark against the grey. As she approached, she noticed the ground was uneven, the soil softer than the surrounding. Turf, a faint outline, rectangular and shallow, caught her eye, a disturbance too deliberate to be natural. Her heart quickened, but her hands were steady as she knelt, using her walking stick to probe the earth. The soil gave easily, revealing a layer of loose dirt that had been recently turned. She worked carefully, mindful of what she might uncover, her thoughts flickering to the churchyard voices and their mention of a grave. After several minutes, her stick struck something solid. Miss Marple brushed away the dirt with gloved hands, uncovering not a body, as she had half feared, but a small wooden box, its surface weathered but intact. It was no larger than a bread tin, secured with a rusty padlock. She lifted it gently, its weight surprising for its size, and examined it in the dim light. The box bore no markings, but a faint scratch on the lid formed a crude C, as if carved in haste. Miss Marple sat back, the box resting on her lap. The shallow grave was not a tomb, but a hiding place, a secret Clara had buried. Perhaps the place no one must find. From her letter, the diary's mention of secrets sleeping here, combined with the locket's photograph of J.H., suggested Clara had hidden something tied to her love and her fear. Was this box the reason for her sudden departure, or the cause of the stranger's return? She tested the padlock, but it held firm, its mechanism too complex for her hairpin. The box would need Mr. Hodges's skill, but its discovery was a breakthrough. Miss Marple glanced around, ensuring she was alone, and tucked the box into her bag, covering the shallow grave with loose soil to conceal her work. The mist was lifting, revealing the moor's stark beauty, but she felt exposed, as if the gorse itself were watching. Her thoughts turned to James Harrow. His questions about the well, so close to this spot, suggested he knew of the box or its significance. The cigarette case, dropped in the churchyard where voices spoke of a shoe and a grave, tied him to the mystery, as did the locket's photograph. Was he the J of Clara's diary, or another seeking what she had hidden? The confession of a burial, the footprints ending at the well, and the lavender scent linking to Grey Manor wove a complex tapestry, with the box as its newest thread. Marple retraced her steps, the box a heavy presence in her bag. She would return to the village, consult Mr. Hodges, and confront Harrow with what she knew. The diary's pages, filled with Clara's longing and dread, hinted at a betrayal, and the locket's photograph suggested a man who might still walk St. Mary Mead's lanes. The shallow grave had yielded not a body, but a secret, and Miss Marple was determined to unlock it. As she reached the lane, the church bell tolled, its sound clear in the thinning mist. The village lay ahead, its cottages serene, but Miss Marple knew its peace was fragile. "Clara," she murmured, her fingers brushing the box, "what did you hide, and who is looking for it?" The trail was narrowing, leading her towards a truth that lay just beyond the next clue. Chapter 12. The Confrontation. The evening shadows stretched long across St. Mary Mead, as Miss Jane Marple prepared her cottage for an unusual gathering. The wooden box from the shallow grave on the moor, its padlock now opened by Mr. Hodges, sat on her parlour table, its contents a chilling revelation that tied together the mystery's threads. The lavender-scented shoe, Clara Winthrop's diary, the locket with C.W. initials, the scrap of blue silk, the cigarette case marked J.H., and the whispers of a grave. The box contained a bundle of letters, a blood-stained handkerchief, and a small key, each item corroborating Clara's diary entries about a forbidden love with a man named J, and a secret that drove her to flee. Miss Marple had invited 3 key figures to her cottage under the guise of a village matter. Mrs. Lavinia Gray, whose lavender gardens linked to the shoe, James Harrow, the supposed historian whose initials and questions about the moors well marked him as a suspect, and Reverend Clements, whose overheard confession of a hidden burial held a piece of the puzzle. Her plan was simple, but bold, to confront them with the evidence, gauge their reactions, and unravel the truth behind Clara's disappearance and the shoe's appearance on her path. The parlour was arranged with precision. Chairs in a semicircle, the table holding the box, diary, locket, and cigarette case, each item carefully placed to draw the eye. Miss Marple, her knitting in her lap to maintain her unassuming air, greeted her guests as they arrived. Mrs. Gray entered first, her black dress crisp, but her hands betraying a faint tremor. Harrow followed, his hat in hand, his eyes scanning the room with guarded curiosity. Reverend Clements arrived last, his face pale, as if sensing the weight of the evening. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice calm but firm. "I've asked you here because of a mystery that began with a single shoe left on my path, a shoe scented with lavender, pointing to a story that touches each of you. I believe we can resolve it together." Mrs. Gray stiffened, her lips thinning. "A shoe? I told you, Miss Marple, I know nothing of it." Harrow's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his fingers brushing the edge of his notebook. Reverend Clements shifted uncomfortably, his eyes on the box. Miss Marple continued, undeterred. "This shoe led me to footprints on the moor, a locket and diary belonging to Clara Winthrop, and a cigarette case marked J.H., found where voices spoke of a grave." She paused, letting the words settle. "And then, in a shallow grave, I found this box." She opened the box, revealing the letters, handkerchief, and key. Clara Winthrop, a young woman who vanished from St. Mary Mead 10 years ago, wrote of a love for a man called J. A love that frightened her, tied to a secret she buried. These letters, written by Clara to J.H., speak of a promise to hide something dangerous, something that could ruin lives. The handkerchief, stained with blood, suggests harm came to someone, and the key, perhaps to a place no one must find. Mrs. Gray's face drained of colour, her hands gripping her chair. Harrow leaned forward, his voice low. "This is speculation, Miss Marple. Old letters and a handkerchief prove nothing." Miss Marple's eyes met his, steady and piercing. "Perhaps, but your arrival, Mr. Harrow, asking about the Moor's Well, near where Clara buried this box, is no coincidence. Your initials match the cigarette case, dropped where I heard talk of a shoe and a grave. And you, Mrs. Gray, grew nervous when I mentioned the shoe's lavender scent, so like your gardens. Reverend Clements, you heard a confession of a burial, a secret that haunts someone still." Reverend Clements clasped his hands, his voice trembling. "I cannot break my vow, but I fear you're close to the truth, Miss Marple. The voice I heard spoke of guilt, of a life lost." Miss Marple turned to the box, lifting the letters. Clara loved a man, James Harrow, or perhaps John Harrow, a gardener at Grey Manor years ago. These letters reveal she discovered a crime. He committed a crime Mrs. Gray helped conceal. The handkerchief, I believe, belonged to a woman harmed by Harrow, a woman whose death was buried, not in a grave, but in silence. Mrs. Gray gasped, her composure cracking. "You can't prove this. I only helped a friend years ago. He said it was an accident that she fell." Harrow stood, his face dark. "Enough! You're weaving tales, old woman. I came here for research, nothing more." Miss Marple's voice cut through, calm but unyielding. "Then explain the cigarette case, Mr. Harrow, and why Clara's letters. Name you as the man she feared. You returned to find this box, didn't you? To ensure the secret stayed buried. But Clara left the shoe, a clue to lead someone to the truth. She hid the box, fled, and hoped her aunt's locket would guide someone to her story." Mrs. Gray broke, tears streaming. "It was an accident." Clara's friend Mary confronted John about his debts. They argued, and she fell, hit her head. John panicked, and I helped him hide her body in the moor. Clara found out, and she ran, leaving that box to haunt us. Harrow lunged for the box, but Miss Marple, anticipating, had already signalled Constable Reed, who waited outside. The door opened, and Harrow froze as Reed stepped in. Reverend Clements bowed his head, whispering a prayer, while Mrs. Gray sobbed, her confession spilling like a dam burst. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting untouched. The shoe had been Clara's final act, a breadcrumb to expose a crime. The box, the diary, the locket, all were her voice, speaking from the past. As Reed led Harrow away and comforted Mrs. Gray, Miss Marple's eyes rested on the shoe. "Clara," she murmured, "you were heard." Chapter 13. The Final Stitch. The soft glow of a single lamp illuminated Miss Jane Marple's parlour as she sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking in a steady rhythm. Outside, St. Mary Mead was cloaked in the quiet of a late autumn evening, the village settling back into its familiar routines. The events of the previous night, the confrontation that exposed James Harrow's crime, Mrs. Gray's complicity, and the truth behind Clara Winthrop's disappearance had left a ripple of shock. But already the village was healing, its resilience as enduring as the cobblestones on its lanes. the lavender-scented shoe, Clara's diary, the locket, the scrap of blue silk, the cigarette case, and the box from the shallow grave were now in Constable Reed's care. Evidence in a case that would see Harrow and Mrs. Gray face justice. The box's contents, letters, a blood-stained handkerchief, and a key, had confirmed Clara's story. Her love for John Harrow, her discovery of his role in Mary's death, and her desperate act to hide the truth in a box buried on the moor. The shoe left on Miss Marple's path had been Clara's final plea. A clue to ensure the secret was unearthed. Miss Marple's needles paused as she reflected on the tapestry of clues. The footprints to the well, the churchyard voices, Reverend Clemence's confession, and the locket buried in her garden had all pointed to a truth Clara had preserved at great cost. Clara had fled St. Mary Mead, not to London as her aunt believed, but to a quiet life elsewhere, her letters ceasing to protect those she left behind. Miss Marple had learned, through a discreet inquiry to a London friend, that Clara was alive, living under a new name, and had sent the shoe years later, perhaps sensing Harrow's return. The fire crackled, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the village. Mrs. Gray, broken by guilt, had confessed fully, revealing how her loyalty to Harrow, a distant cousin, had led her to conceal Mary's body in a remote corner of the moor. The lavender scent on the shoe, a trace from her gardens, had been an accident, a thread that unravelled her secret. Harrow, driven by fear that Clara's box would expose him, had returned as James, his historian guise a cover to search for it. The cigarette case, dropped in his haste, and his questions about the well had betrayed him. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the scarf growing under her fingers. She thought of Clara's courage, leaving a trail for someone to follow, and of Mary, whose death had been silenced until now. The shallow grave had held not a body, but a truth, and the village, though shaken, would mend. Reverend Clemence had offered a quiet service for Mary, her resting place now marked, and Miss Winthrop, Clara's aunt, had wept with relief to know her niece lived. The mystery had begun with a single shoe, a small thing that might have been overlooked. Yet Miss Marple knew the power of small things, stitches in a scarf, words in a diary, a glint in the soil. They were the threads that bound life's stories, and she had followed them with care. The village would talk of this for years, embellishing the tale, but Miss Marple needed no embellishment. The truth, plain and sharp, was enough. She set her, knitting aside, and rose to make tea, glancing at the empty table where the clues had once rested. The fire cast a warm glow, and outside the stars were bright above St. Mary Mead. "Secrets are fragile," she murmured, "and a single clue can break them." With a faint smile, she turned to her kettle, content that the final stitch in this mystery had been neatly sewn.